That's literally a coyote.
Coyotes roaming the streets. In some places, sea turtles nesting on beaches for the first time in years.
We predict that with these fewer interactions, if the beach closures go on any longer due to COVID, that we will see possibly more successful nesting events with the sea turtles.
Wildlife around the world wandering freely in cities and regions normally bustling with people. Just one of the ways in which the coronavirus lockdown has quickly and dramatically changed our environment. Less foot traffic, less waste, less energy consumption, allowing certain animals to thrive, even altering the Earth's atmosphere. We've heard about these emission reductions. What kind of reductions have we seen?
We've seen reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, those gases that contribute to climate change. But we've also seen reductions in sort of the typical air pollution, the particulates, the smog. And we've seen, remarkably, some amazing improvements in air quality.
In India, for the first time in decades, the majestic snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas were revealed to the people of Jalandhar more than 120 miles away. In the normally polluted city of New Delhi, clear skies. Here in the United States, the plummeting emissions were evident almost immediately. In mid-April, Los Angeles registering the cleanest air of any major city on the planet. But this goes beyond the blue skies. So, Chris, while we know that our CO2 levels have dropped maybe 8%, but we've seen these other levels drop, like smog and air pollution. Mm-hmm. Are there any benefits to that?
Sure. I mean, the typical things you think of as pollution, like smog, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, if we reduce these things, they're going to have a positive impact on our health. We know that these are linked to respiratory ailments and other things.
While these signs of renewal are encouraging, climatologists say the change in the air is only temporary and not nearly enough.
The projection right now is an 8% drop in our emissions this year. That needs to be the reduction year after year, not just 8% in 1 year. If we keep our CO2 emissions at bay, meaning reduce them by 8% per year, we'll be able to avoid 2 degrees of global warming.
When the world finally heals and our societies come back, is there a way to make these changes permanent without hurting our economy?
We can have a strong economy, but improve our air quality, and they're taking steps in that direction. We can reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases by switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We know that wind and solar work. We know they're economic. We know that they're growing very rapidly.
Peter, there's some lessons to be learned from this pandemic that probably could be applied to climate change, aren't there?
There are important lessons. We need to listen to scientists. We need to figure out how to get the politicians to pay attention to the science. We need to understand that these aren't political problems. They're social problems. If we keep them out of the political realm, I think the possibility of addressing them will be much faster and much easier.
As we come out of this, is there a silver lining?
A pandemic or a financial crisis is nobody's idea of a solution to the climate crisis at all. But if we do look back and see that when humans, whether we had a choice or not, made changes and the needle moved in terms of the global climate and the environment, that may be seen as, a reminder that we're in control and we have a responsibility and the ability to actually move that needle.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.